Hello and welcome back to the Governors for Schools podcast. It's the second week of our Counting the Cost campaign, which means we're addressing a new theme affecting school communities. Last week, we looked at some of the ways the cost of living crisis is affecting building and estate management in schools, and how governors can help school leaders juggle rising energy costs and maintenance issues. This week, we're looking beyond the school gates to examine how the rising cost of living affects families struggling to cover their children's educational needs. From school uniforms and lunches to trips and educational experiences, the number of costs associated with sending a child to school can be overwhelming for low-income families. So, what can schools and governors do to mitigate the impact of this growing crisis? To discuss this issue with me today is Kate Anstey from Child Poverty Action Group, a charity working to understand the causes of poverty and how we can work towards meaningful and long-term solutions for children across the UK. Kate, welcome to the show, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. Really looking forward to discussing this.
Great. So just to start us off, really, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and what Child Poverty Action Group does?
Absolutely. So Child Poverty Action Group works on behalf of the more than 1 in 4 children across the UK growing up in poverty. And as you said in your intro, we are researching and looking into the sort of causes and consequences of child poverty, and particularly in the work that I do through the Cost of the School Day project, which I'll talk a bit more about. And we're looking at what those costs and what child poverty kind of feels like for children and young people, particularly in the school environment. So I head up a project called the Cost of School Day that looks at, I guess, the financial barriers to education that children and young people face, and how that feels, but also what can be done to remove some of those costs within the school environment.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the Cost of the School Day project there, which I think has, never been more vital now as the cost of living crisis is kind of ongoing. So could you just tell us a little bit more about some of the key issues the initiative kind of addresses?
Sure. So first of all, I suppose it's useful to understand the scale of child poverty and what we're talking about here. So at the moment, according to the latest data we have, around 8 children in a classroom of 30 live below the poverty line. And I'm sure lots of people listening to this will be aware that in lots of classrooms it's much higher than that. Now, what's happened in the last year or so with the cost of living crisis is that families with children have been particularly badly affected because of certain things that have risen in costs, like food and energy. Families with children need more of that, but also lots of the packages of support that have come out haven't really targeted families with children. So they've been kind of really badly hit by this current situation. And I suppose what we're seeing in schools is that those costs that are associated with school, it's becoming more and more difficult for families to meet those costs. And I think I will say that school costs have always been an issue. This hasn't come around recently, but actually what we're hearing from families is that some of those parents who previously could manage some of those costs are actually unable to meet them now, and families are struggling more and more. And we're seeing it from the side of teachers and head teachers as well, we're seeing in our classrooms the impact of poverty and the impact of cost of living crisis affecting many more of our families than maybe they kind of previously saw. And also, I suppose, maybe often it's more hidden, and it's not necessarily obvious who those families are. So it's becoming sort of also kind of increasingly difficult for schools, with more families being affected.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of, let's dig down a little bit into the costs that you mentioned. So what are the kind of the key costs that are affecting parents, carers and families, particularly when it comes to supporting young people's education?
Yeah, so in terms of the research we carry out, we have spoken to around 12,000 pupils across the UK about school costs and over 2,000 parents and carers. And what has come through very strongly, particularly when we were sort of analysing the research in England, in English schools, is that there were sort of 4 main areas that were causing, or kind of common themes that were causing big challenges for families. So the first one of those, and some of these won't be surprising, but the first one is kind of school uniform and material items, material possessions that children need for school. Now, when we've spoken to kids and families about this, it comes through that actually there are many sort of school policies that exist, uniform policies that exist, that place big requirements on families to have a long list of compulsory items, certain like branded items. extra things like logos on shorts, etc. And all of these things kind of add up for families and mean that actually uniform is this really kind of huge cost. And particularly if you have more than one child, it's kind of a huge financial outlay for families. So that's kind of number one in terms of big costs. The second one we hear a lot about is school food. And there are many, many issues around kind of the school food system. So everything from excuse me, from those families who are not eligible for free school meals, feeling like the cost of food is too much. Children who are eligible for free school meals, actually, sometimes they've told us that their experience around school food can be stigmatizing. It can make them feel different. Other things that we hear about is increasing amounts of dinner money debt that families are facing, and sort of problems around how that's dealt with in schools. And we hear from children and young people about the portion sizes. So I suppose school food is a really complex issue, but it comes up, and it has come up in every single school that we've worked in, as being kind of a challenge for lower income families. And because of those issues, we see lots of children kind of missing out on food and not getting what they need at lunchtime. The third area that we hear a lot about is curriculum and learning. So what I mean by that is the kind of costs associated with subjects at school and learning. And actually children are telling us that if you don't have money, it's very difficult to kind of fully participate in everything that school life has to offer. So, if you haven't bought the right calculator, or you haven't got the right textbook, or if you haven't got the sort of materials for art and design, then actually you can't take part in the way that everybody else can. And what we heard particularly from secondary school pupils, is that they were basing subject choices on the costs associated with those subjects. So actually they were avoiding things like music or food tech because they knew that it came with a cost. And I think you can kind of start to see how children's kind of pathways through schools can be very affected by these costs that they're facing and the impact of that. I suppose the fourth challenge that we hear a lot about, and we've summarised this as kind of school fun. So all of those things that are part of school life that lots of children look forward to and bring a kind of sense of joy. So things like the nativity play, or charity days, fundraising days, your school fair, your book fairs, etc. These are all things that help to add extra enjoyment to school. But actually, if you don't have much money, then it's really, really difficult to look forward to those occasions, and you can often really feel left out. There was one child just talking about even a cake sale, saying that they couldn't afford a cake like their friends, and one of their friends had to buy one for them. And it was that feeling of not feeling included in the school environment. So I say those four are the kind of key themes that have come through from schools in England.
Yeah, it's so much when you kind of lay it out like that, isn't it? So this might be slightly more difficult to answer in terms of, the cost of living crisis is fairly recent, or it's sort of building, in the fairly recent months. But can you kind of speak a little bit about the ways in which sort of the current crisis, acknowledging that it's been sort of issues surrounding the cost of the school day have been ongoing for a while, but how the cost of living crisis affected the child poverty action group's work, and how have things changed in the schools over the past year or so?
Sure, yeah. I would say that I kind of mentioned we're hearing from families more and more that they're kind of struggling with these costs. Alongside that, we've been working with a coalition of organisations, unions, etc., who represent governors, head teachers, other school staff. And we've been kind of talking to them about what they're seeing in schools. And it's really clear from their perspective that the challenge is getting much worse in terms of that kind of deepening child poverty, seeing more of it in their school. I guess schools also having less capacity to sort of manage, and less funding to kind of manage and support families. So it is a kind of challenge for everybody. It kind of affects every part of school life. And I think it just on very kind of practical, simple levels, we've spoken to young people who've told us actually we've seen the cost of our school food go up. We used to be able to buy this much for this amount, and now we can't. So it's kind of playing out in lots of different ways. But I think the big problem, or the big thing we're seeing, is that as these costs become less manageable for families, This means children are less able to access their full education. And actually, what the coalition that we've been working with is saying is that they're seeing children kind of falling behind on learning as a result of the sort of poverty that they're experiencing. So this is not something that should be ignored. This is a kind of huge thing that we do need to address, and that, like, yeah, the cost of living crisis is sort of contributing to those educational disparities.
Mm. So in terms of kind of mitigating these disparities, what kind of support organisations or initiatives or grants can you kind of point parents, carers and schools towards for mitigating these school-related costs?
So the first thing I would say that's come through in our research is that often parents don't know exactly what support is on offer. So we'll speak to the school and they'll say we provide all these subsidies, but actually that information isn't necessarily getting through to parents. So I would say the first point of call is just make sure that you are speaking to your school and understanding what's on offer, because they may be able to help with trips or uniform, and you don't want to miss out on that support. I would also say it's really important for families to check whether they are eligible for free school meals. Again, we know there's quite a large percentage, or there's a percentage of families who actually are missing out on free school meals because they're not aware that they're eligible for it. So again, you can speak to your school about this. They can help you to fill out a registration form or check your eligibility. And again, that's something that if you are eligible for free school meals, that can save families around £440 a year. Makes a big difference. Another thing to be aware of for families and schools is that the new uniform bill has come in. So this is, schools now have a kind of legal obligation from government to prioritise affordability in their uniform policies. And I think that is hopefully sort of being implemented and being rolled out in schools. But any parents who are listening to this, they really can sort of they can speak to their school about this and make sure their school understands that they have this legal obligation to bring down the costs. Because, as I mentioned, the uniform costs are some of the biggest. In addition to that, in some local authorities, there are sort of local authority grants to support families with uniforms. So again, make sure you're checking your local authority website. They might also help with kind of trips as well. And then in addition to that, there'll be lots of kind of local charities and support around. So, there's a number of charities out there that support with kind of school clothing and shoes, etc. So yeah, I'd say kind of look out for localized support. But yeah, those are some of the sort of big bits of help that are on offer.
Yeah, it's helpful to kind of highlight those initiatives that are available to parents. But kind of on the school side, obviously, to some extent, the crisis operates like on this structural level that presents really significant challenges to schools looking to tackle kind of educational inequities. But having said this, are there any kind of simple policy changes schools can implement to minimise spending on, all these various different expenses, schools, meals, trips, etc., that might present some kind of quick wins, I suppose?
Yes, so I would really encourage schools to go out and speak to families and children about the costs and sort of understand in their local context what's providing the most challenges for families. But there are definitely things that we would encourage all schools to think about and kind of check they're doing. So, to start off thinking about uniform within the new guidance, it really encourages or suggests that every school should have pre-loved uniform or second-hand uniform provision on offer. So, schools really, if they're not doing that already, they should be really thinking about how they can put that in place. And we actually developed a resource with the Children's Society and Children North East that really support schools with setting up that pre-loved provision in a really sort of dignified and compassionate way. So I'd recommend kind of looking out for those school uniform guides to help with that. On free school meals, I mentioned there are lots of families who are eligible but not currently registered, and so we would encourage schools to really think about their registration process. Are you making sure families are filling out a form when they first come to your school? Are there kind of incentives around that you can use? Because again, if you get families signed up to free school meals who are eligible, that has a knock-on effect in terms of pupil premium funding. And of course, if you get sort of your full allocation of pupil premium funding, you can use that to support things like breakfast clubs, etc., that are helpful for families as well. In terms of other things, we've created a sort of calendar called the Cost of School Day calendar, and that goes through every month, month by month, all of the kind of pinch points or things that come up and might cause families problems. So everything from those, your kind of Christmas jumper day or World Book Day, or other sort of days in the year that might create a problem. And in that calendar, we've given lots of kind of alternative ideas and examples of what families can do. So just to give more examples, we know some schools on World Book Day, rather than asking children to kind of dress up and bring in money, which can be a real challenge for families, we ask them to kind of, they're thinking about ways they can focus more on the reading. So we had one school that set up some bell tents in their playground and filled them with books, and invited children and parents to come in and listen to people, sort of special guests reading. So it was really kind of putting the focus back on the purpose of the day rather than those elements of World Book Day that kind of sometimes can increase costs for families. Other things that you can think about is just making sure you're looking at thoroughly at your curriculum and understanding where some of those costs might lie, or where children are paying for resources and tools, and just make sure that just think about how you can reduce some of those costs, or offer subsidies. But yeah, I would say there are lots and lots of examples in our resources about things that schools are doing. We had another school who, instead of a charity day, did a kind of, instead of a dress-up day, did like a kind of crazy hair day or odd sock day. So these might seem like small things, but actually when you kind of piece it all together, they do make a big difference for the way that children feel about school and how much they feel included. And it also brings down the costs for families.
Yeah, some great ideas there. And these resources are available on your website, aren't they?
Yes. So
Yes.
if you go to TPAG, Cost of the School Day, and then there's a resources page where all of this is included.
Great. So I guess quite a complex way that the cost of living crisis is really affecting children from low-income households is related to kind of stigma surrounding poverty and social welfare. So how can schools and governors kind of work to minimise the potential for kind of stigmatising behaviour in schools?
So one of the first things I would say is really important, and this kind of came through in our project, is about kind of staff awareness and understanding of poverty. We kind of spoke to schools before we started the project, and actually they felt like they were doing all they could to support families. And then through the process of working with us, we've kind of uncovered more policies and practices that they could put in place. So I think school staff are really kind of good at knowing their cohort, their school, but actually school staff sort of attending training on poverty specifically, just to really kind of ensure they understand kind of the scale of poverty, the impact it has on children, and really practically what they can do about it in their school. So I'd say kind of accessing training, even especially kind of governors accessing that training as well, just to ensure there's not kind of a disconnect between what governors think is sort of happening in the school and the reality of it. So really sort of push that. Other things that schools can do around stigma, I think, is really thinking about the language and communication that they put out to families and children. So in all of the schools that we've worked with, we've actually sort of advised them or given them kind of templates around the types of language they can use in any kind of correspondence with families, just to make sure that that correspondence is really kind of compassionate, and make sure that sort of anything on offer is universal and isn't just targeted at particular families using particular language that might put them off. So again, I think that's something to really think about on the stigma front. And then I guess this sort of more broadly, when schools are thinking about their policies and practices, kind of looking at them through a poverty sensitive lens. So have you thought about how that might be experienced for a child facing poverty? And an example of this is, how schools might administer free school meals, which I kind of touched on earlier. But I think lots of schools think they've kind of removed the stigma by having kind of cashless systems at lunch. But actually, when you talk to children and young people, they can still distinguish which of their peers are on free school meals and which aren't, simply by things like those certain children aren't able to access the same menu or opportunity or food as others, or at the kind of counter, school staff or kitchen staff might kind of mention, you haven't got enough money for that, your allocation doesn't stretch that far, your free school meals allocation. So there are kind of these little ways in which children and young people pick up on things. So I think it's for the school to really kind of understand and think about their policies and practices from that lens, and as I said, kind of talk to children and young people and parents about their experiences. But yeah, as I say, also again, lots more examples in our resources of kind of, particularly I think around the stuff I was saying on school fun. That is where we see a lot of kind of stigma and feeling of not included in things. So I think that's a particular area where schools, by like looking into those resources, might be able to pick up on some ways they can change those practices.
Yeah, great. That's all really helpful. So just to kind of wrap up the final question, are there any questions you would kind of encourage governors to raise during board meetings to ensure schools are doing everything they can to support pupils from lower income households?
Yeah, there are lots of questions, I think. And actually, I would say at the beginning of this, we devised a toolkit with the National Governance Association that is on their website, sort of a toolkit on poverty, and it includes lots of kind of questions that for governors to have a think about and to ask their boards. But I suppose a couple of kind of headline ones might be for the board to really question whether they kind of know exactly how much it costs for families to fully participate in school life. Have they kind of looked across the whole of the school experience and kind of carried out that exercise of understanding kind of what costs money at our school, what are families paying for? And having done that exercise, I suppose, do they believe that that's affordable? Is it accessible? Can they sort of check that with families? And if not, where are the areas where you could bring those costs down significantly? So I think the first thing is kind of getting a picture of what your school actually costs, and working from there. Another thing is just really monitoring the data and asking those questions around, are we collecting data on which students are taking part in what activities? So, for example, if you're running after school clubs and breakfast clubs, are there particular children that time and time again aren't accessing those? And might it be that kind of cost is a barrier to them? So I think monitoring data is really important. I've touched on this a few times, but do you have in your school kind of opportunities for parents and pupils to feed in around school costs? Do you have that sort of those opportunities for dialogue to understand this issue? And then a couple of other things just to note, I would say, like, does your school have a nominated person that parents can come and speak to if they are having a challenge around costs? One of the things that came through in the research is actually that parents feel very reluctant or nervous about sharing information or disclosing financial information with their schools. So how are you kind of setting your school up in a way that it's really easy for families to come and speak to somebody if they are struggling? So those are a few things, but as I say, if you head to that toolkit on the NGA website, that gives a lot more sort of questions to work through around this topic.
Yeah, great. We'll put the link to that in the show notes so people can access it, as well as the Child Poverty Action Group website. Are there any other kind of resources or channels through which people can find you?
So in terms of other resources, we produced a really helpful toolkit with the National Education Union and Children North East called Turning the Page on Poverty. And I would say that's a really useful kind of starting point for schools and governors who are kind of beginning their journey on this and wanting to understand a bit more about the data, but also a bit more about what they can do, what questions they should be asking. So that's another one to kind of look out for. And yeah, we will be continuing as Child Poverty Action Group, will be continuing to kind of research and talk to children and young people and families about their experience of school and kind of understand how the picture is changing and what that might mean for families. So yeah, I would say kind of keep an eye on us. And we are also on Twitter at CPAG UK, but I would check that. But yeah, there'll be lots of information there about kind of briefings and things that we're putting out as well.
Great, fab. We'll put the handle in the show notes too. So yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today, Kate. We really appreciate your insights, and I'm sure listeners will find all of this really useful, whether or not they're governors. So yeah.
And I think what I would say as a final piece is of course, it's not on schools to kind of resolve or eradicate child poverty. That is for governments to work on, but there is so much, our work has shown there is so much that can be done within the school setting to mitigate some of the effects and bring down those costs and kind of take pressures off families. So anyone in their classroom can make a difference to children and young people's lives.
Yeah, indeed. That's I think that's a really good note to end on. So I'll just finish up by first of all Extending our thanks to Alan and Overy for generously sponsoring our campaign and making podcasts like this possible. To discover more about Counting the Cost, please visit our website at governorsforschools.org.uk and head to our campaign webpage. There you can catch up on our latest resources, which we'll be releasing throughout the campaign. And please do remember to subscribe to our podcast and share our campaign materials with your friends and colleagues. So bye for now, and tune in next week when we'll be chatting about pupil development and enrichment during the cost of living crisis.